Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. My brother dragged me across the banquet hall just to make me a punchline for the wealthiest people in the room. He proudly introduced me as our family failure, but the father of the bride did not laugh. He stared, recognizing the ghost who saved his corporate empire from total ruin. In mere seconds, that calculated insult became the exact spark needed to burn my brother's new marriage and his fraudulent ambitions straight to the ground. My name is Aspen Rodriguez. I am 35 years old, and I make a living looking at the things people try to bury. I live in San Antonio, where I run a small, strictly independent consulting firm called Blue Mesa Risk Studio. My profession is highly specific, demanding a tolerance for endless paperwork and a fundamental distrust of human nature. I am a disaster reconstruction cost and loss system analyst. When a hurricane tears through a coastline, when a flood washes away a neighborhood, or when a wildfire erases a zip code, federal and private money floods in to rebuild. Where money floods, greed follows almost immediately. I read the aftermath. I sift through housing receipts to find the invisible threads of fraud that local adjusters and federal monitors miss. To me, numbers speak a very clear language. They show me the phantom contractors, the artificially inflated material costs, the deliberate delays designed to bleed insurance policies dry. It is quiet, meticulous, and profoundly unglamorous work. In the eyes of my family, my career is merely a source of low-level embarrassment. It is incredibly hard to explain at cocktail parties. It lacks the shiny veneer of corporate executive titles, the lucrative prestige of high finance, or the simple respectability of medicine or law. When wealthy relatives or family friends ask what I do, my parents usually change the subject or offer a vague mumble about computers and insurance. I do not fit into the narrative they have spent decades meticulously crafting. To them, my job is not a career. It is a bizarre hobby that pays the bills but brings zero social capital. That grand narrative of success belongs entirely to my older brother, Grant Rodriguez. Grant is the undisputed pride of our bloodline. He is 37 years old, polished, fiercely ambitious, charismatic, and armed with the kind of practiced smile that makes people open their wallets and lower their defenses. Today, that smile has secured the ultimate prize. Grant is marrying Delaney Kincaid. Delaney is the sole heiress to Owen Kincaid. Owen is a titan, a legitimate billionaire whose corporate empire dominates the disaster home restoration industry across the entire country. Grant is not just taking a wife today. He is annexing a kingdom. He is securing a legacy that our parents could only dream of touching. The wedding reception is being held at an ultra-exclusive luxury resort nestled deep in the rolling hills just outside Fredericksburg, Texas. The venue is a monument to excessive intimidating wealth. The vaulted ceilings are draped in cascading white silk and thousands of rare orchids hang floral chandeliers. The air smells of expensive perfume, roasted meats, and the crisp metallic tang of cold money. Waiters in immaculate white coats glide across the polished marble floors carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. But make no mistake, this is not a celebration of love. It is a high-stakes corporate audition. The massive room is packed with state politicians, regional directors, insurance mogul, and venture capitalists. You can physically feel the weight of their combined net worth pressing down on the space. Even the delicate crystal champagne flutes seem designed to silently judge the worthiness of the hands that hold them. I am holding one of those flutes, sitting exactly where I was designed to sit. He held a microphone in one hand and a half-full glass of champagne in the other. He possessed a commanding presence, the kind of rugged, old-school charm that made people lean in when he spoke. I am seated mere inches away from the swinging service doors of the massive catering kitchen. Every few minutes, a rush of hot air smelling of seared beef, garlic, and industrial dish soap blasts against my bare shoulders as the frantic staff rushes in and out. I am geographically isolated from the grand head table, separated by dozens of yards from my parents, and surrounded by obscure second cousins of the groom whom no one actually likes or speaks to. My placement is not an administrative oversight. It is a calculated geographic statement. My presence here is a forced biological obligation, not an act of familial affection. I am the dark smudge on the edge of their floorless oil painting before the first course is even served. The architects of my isolation make their designated rounds. My mother, Eleanor, approaches my table with a glass of sparkling water clutched in her perfectly manicured hand. Her eyes perform a slow, systematic, and brutally critical scan of my dark navy dress. It is a tasteful, tailored piece, but I can practically see her mentally cataloging its lack of recognized designer labels. She reaches up and adjusts the collar of her own custom silk gown, a silent assertion of aesthetic superiority, and offers a tight practiced smile that completely fails to reach her eyes. She leans in and tells me to sit up straight, acting as if I am a difficult teenager sulking at a tedious holiday dinner rather than a grown woman running her own company. My father, Hector, follows closely behind her, acting as her ever-loyal enforcer. He places a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder, his grip just slightly too tight to be considered a gesture of love. He leans down, his voice dropping into that familiar, authoritative register he has used to manage me since childhood. He tells me to behave myself tonight. He firmly instructs me not to make everything about myself. The sheer breathtaking absurdity of the statement almost makes me laugh out loud. I am seated next to a busboy station in the literal shadows of the room. I have never been the center of their universe for a single second of my entire life. Yet they remain perpetually terrified that my mere existence might somehow steal a fraction of the spotlight from Grant. I nod silently, taking a slow sip of room temperature water, offering absolutely no resistance because resistance is exactly what they crave. A little while later, the golden groom himself makes his grand appearance. Grant detaches himself from a tight circle of wealthy investors and strides confidently over to my exiled corner. He looks immaculate in his bespoke tuxedo, his hair perfectly swept back, his teeth blindingly white against his tanned skin. He places both hands flat on my table and leans in close, expertly projecting an image of loving brotherly intimacy for anyone who might be watching from the center of the room. But his eyes up close are cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of any genuine warmth. He asks if I'm enjoying the food, not bothering to pause for my answer. Then his voice drops to a sharp conspiratorial whisper. He tells me that there are a lot of very important, very powerful people in this room tonight. He tells me to mingle if I want, but strictly advises me to keep my mouth shut about my business. He suggests I should just tell people I work in basic administration. His exact words cut sharply through the ambient noise of the string quartet playing in the background. He says people will not understand what I do, that my work sounds weird and depressing, and that talking about disaster fraud will completely ruin the light, celebratory mood of his perfect evening. He pats my cheek twice, a deeply patronizing gesture that makes my skin crawl, and walks back into the glittering crowd without a backward glance, sitting alone as the heavy bass from the band vibrates through the polished floorboards. The true reality of the evening crystallizes in my mind. The heady, deliberate isolation, the condescending parental visits, the strategic, humiliating seating arrangement. They are not just trying to quietly hide me away in the dark. They are actively trying to crop me out of their perfect family portrait. But my brother is a creature driven by massive ego, and simply hiding me is not enough to satisfy him. He thrives on sharp contrast. He needs a dull shadow to make his own golden light seem so much brighter to his new wealthy in-laws. Watching him smoothly navigate the enormous room, shaking hands and throwing his head back in booming theatrical laughter, I recognize the underlying pattern. It is the exact same behavioral pattern I look for in complex fraudulent claims. The careful build-up, the strategic positioning of assets, the flawless execution of the lie. Grant is not ignoring me at all. He has placed me exactly where he needs me to be. He has primed our parents, set the stage, and firmly established my role as the odd, embarrassing sister. He is simply biding his time, waiting for the perfect high-visibility moment. As the expensive wine flows freely and the lengthy speeches prepare to commence, I know with absolute chilling certainty that my brother is planning something public. He is going to use my presence as a prop to elevate his own status in front of Owen Kincaid and his elite peers. He is waiting for the room to quiet down just enough to turn my quiet existence into his personal cruel entertainment. The trap is meticulously set. The wealthy audience is captive, and the suffocating wait for the inevitable punchline has begun. The banquet hall had reached that specific pitch of wealthy intoxication. It was perhaps 9:00 in the evening, though time felt distorted under the glare of the crystal chandeliers. The string quartet had been replaced by a 12-piece band that pumped heavy rhythmic bass into the floorboards. I was staring at the dregs of my water glass when a hand clamped down on my left wrist. It was not a gentle tap. It was a vice grip, bone deep and startlingly aggressive. I jolted upward, my chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. Grant stood over me. His face was flushed. Whether from the vintage wine or the sheer adrenaline of his own vanity, I could not tell. He did not ask me to follow him. He simply pivoted and began to pull. He dragged me away from the safety of my isolated corner and directly into the blinding center of the room. I stumbled in my heels for the first few steps, desperately trying to maintain my balance and avoid spilling onto the lap of a startled state senator. Grant did not slow down. His grip remained tight, propelling me through the maze of silk-draped tables. The ambient noise of the room rushed past my ears in a blur of laughter, clinking silverware, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. I felt like a misbehaving child being marched to the principal's office, stripped of all agency and dignity. Our destination was the absolute epicenter of the ballroom. A towering floral arrangement of white roses and imported lace framed a small exclusive circle of men and women. This was the High Court. Here stood the venture capitalists, the corporate lawyers billing thousands of dollars an hour, the ruthless insurance adjusters, and the regional directors who treated disaster zones like personal gold mines. And standing precisely in the middle of them all, holding a glass of amber scotch, was Owen Kincaid, the billionaire patriarch, the man whose empire Grant was currently marrying into. Grant pulled me to a sudden jarring halt right at the edge of this terrifying circle. The conversation around Owen naturally ceased. High-powered executives turned their heads, their eyes sliding over me with practiced, calculating indifference. They took in my simple dress, my lack of flashy jewelry, and my bewildered expression, instantly categorizing me as a non-entity. Grant released my wrist, draped his arm heavily around my shoulders in a suffocating parody of sibling affection, and flashed a smile so bright and artificial it could have shattered glass. He looked directly at his new father-in-law, then projecting his voice so that it carried easily over the music and the surrounding chatter, he delivered the punchline he had been rehearsing all night. "Owen, you simply must meet this one," Grant announced, his tone dripping with mock endearment. "This is our family failure." The words dropped into the space between us like stones tossed into a stagnant pond. For a fraction of a second, my brain refused to process the syllables. The sheer audacity, the public cruelty of it paralyzed my vocal cords. I stood frozen under the blazing chandeliers, an object of ridicule offered up on a silver platter to impress a room full of strangers, right on cue, as if they had practiced this routine in front of a mirror. My mother materialized beside us. Elena let out a high melodic laugh. It was a terrible tinkling sound designed to signal to the wealthy crowd that this was all just a charming, self-deprecating family joke. It was her way of apologizing for my existence. My father was right behind her. Hector chuckled, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh. He stepped forward, eager to contribute his own handful of dirt to my burial. He looked at the gathered executives and offered a dismissive wave of his hand. He told them that I always insisted on doing these strange, incomprehensible little jobs that nobody could understand or explain. He said, "I like to play with spreadsheets while the rest of the family built actual careers." A ripple of polite, deeply uncomfortable laughter moved through the circle of executives. They chuckled into their champagne flutes, not because the joke was funny, but because Grant was the groom, Owen was the boss, and displaying amusement was the socially required currency of the moment. But not everyone laughed. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the bride. Delaney Kincaid was standing a few feet away, holding the small silver clutch. The polite, radiant smile she had worn all evening completely vanished from her face. She looked at Grant, her eyes wide and suddenly sharp. She did not see a joke. She saw the naked, gleaming edge of the blade her new husband had just driven into his own sister's back. Delaney stiffened, her posture shifting from relaxed celebration to sudden chilling alertness. And then the atmosphere in the circle fundamentally shifted. The polite chuckles died in the throats of the executives. The sycophantic smiles faltered. The reason for the sudden drop in temperature was Owen Kincaid. The billionaire did not laugh. He did not smile. He did not offer a polite nod of acknowledgement. He simply stood there, an immovable mountain of a man in a dark charcoal suit, staring directly at me. His gaze was incredibly heavy, stripped of all social pleasantries. It was the look of a man who evaluated sinking ships and burning cities for a living. He looked at me for 3, maybe 4 long seconds. In the context of a bustling wedding reception, that amount of silence is an eternity. The music seemed to fade into the background. The clinking glasses stopped finally. Owen lowered his glass of scotch. He took a single, deliberate step forward, ignoring Grant entirely. His voice when he spoke was a low, resonant baritone that carried absolute authority. "What did you say her name was?" Owen asked, speaking very slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. Grant puffed out his chest, attempting to maintain the casual, jovial momentum he had created. He flashed his teeth again, though the corners of his mouth twitched with the first microscopic signs of panic. He told Owen my name was Aspen Rodriguez. He tried to add another dismissive comment, something about how I rarely got out of the house, but the words died on his tongue. Owen took another step closer. The physical space between us vanished. The billionaire was no longer looking at a stranger in a cheap dress. He was looking at a ghost. The realization hit his features like a physical blow. The polite mask of the wealthy host dissolved, replaced by a stark, intense focus that had likely built his ruthless empire. The silence in our immediate circle was no longer just awkward. It was terrifying. Every single executive, lawyer, and investor was holding their breath, waiting for the Titan to react. Owen Kincaid looked back at my brother. His expression was completely unreadable, a blank slate of pure concentrated power. "A failure," Owen repeated. The word sounded foreign and metallic coming from his mouth. He turned his attention back to me, addressing the entire captive audience, but speaking solely to my soul. "If this woman standing in front of me is indeed Aspen Rodriguez," Owen declared, his voice cutting through the dead air like a steel blade, "then she's the sole reason a massive fraction of my company survived utter ruin. She saved my empire." The entire ballroom seemed to collectively stop breathing. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of a lull in conversation. It was the vacuum created immediately after an explosion. I watched the color violently drain from Grant's face. His golden perfect tan turned a sickening shade of gray in a matter of milliseconds. The arrogant smirk shattered completely, leaving his mouth hanging slightly open in genuine, unadulterated shock. His arms fell limply to his sides. Beside him, Elena and Hector looked as though they had been physically struck by lightning. My mother's glass of sparkling water trembled violently in her hand, droplets spilling unnoticed onto her designer silk gown. My father stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound emerging. The narrative they had worshipped their entire lives, the gospel of Grant, the golden child, and Aspen, the obscure disappointment, had just been obliterated by the most powerful man in the room. I did not move. I stood my ground under the blinding chandeliers, my heartbeat pounding a steady, deafening rhythm in my ears. As I looked at the ashen faces of my family and the calculating stare of Owen Kincaid, the true gravity of the night settled into my bones. This was no longer just a wedding. It was not a simple display of petty family cruelty. The ground beneath our feet had fractured, and a massive, dangerous truth had just clawed its way to the surface. I realized with a sudden cold clarity that this night had merely unlocked the door to a war that was infinitely larger than any insult my brother could ever devise. 4 years ago, the sky over the Gulf Coast broke open and poured the sea into the streets. They called it Hurricane Allura, but for the people living in its path, it was simply the end of the world as they knew it. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, I was nobody of consequence. I was certainly not a risk consultant operating my own independent firm. I was merely a temporary low-level contractor working the graveyard shift at a sprawling windowless facility operated by Redbridge Claims Solutions. My hourly wage was barely enough to cover the rent on my damp studio apartment, let alone enough to buy influence or attention. My assigned task was brutally repetitive and emotionally exhausting. I wore a heavy, uncomfortable plastic headset for 10 grueling hours a night, typing the fractured details of ruined lives into a sluggish, constantly crashing corporate database. The volume of human misery was staggering. Thousands upon thousands of files flooded our servers every single day. Through the static of the phone lines, I listened to the raw, unfiltered panic of homeowners who had lost absolutely everything they owned in a matter of hours. I heard the bone-deep exhaustion in the voices of mothers holding crying infants in the back seats of sedans because the local motel were booked solid for 100 miles in any direction. They called desperately to report collapsed roofs, knee-deep toxic sludge pooling in their living rooms, and the rapid silent spread of black mold creeping up their interior walls. It was a relentless chorus of desperation, and my only job was to assign a tracking number and move to the next call. But as the weeks dragged on and the initial shock of the storm faded into the grueling reality of recovery, I stopped listening strictly to the voices and started listening to the underlying numbers. The data began to sing a very different, highly disturbing song. The federal and private system designed to process these claims and deploy resources was completely broken. It was not prioritizing the homes that were genuinely uninhabitable or structurally dangerous. Instead, the entire operational queue was being aggressively manipulated by people who stood to profit immensely from the chaos. Predatory contractors swarmed the disaster zone like sharks scenting blood in the water. They recognized early on that the disaster relief funds were vast, poorly monitored pools of cash just waiting to be siphoned. Sitting in the dim glow of my dual monitors at 3 in the morning, I noticed a terrifying, undeniable pattern. Minor claims, issues like a few missing roof shingles or damp garage floors were suddenly and consistently being flagged with top-tier emergency priority codes. These low-level, easily fixable problems were being paired with massive artificially inflated invoices for accelerated material delivery, hazardous debris removal, and premium rate labor. Meanwhile, the actual catastrophic losses, the homes with no roofs, compromised foundations, and exposed electrical wires were languishing at the very bottom of the processing list. They were stuck waiting on basic municipal inspection permits that seemed perpetually trapped in an engineered administrative purgatory. The system was rigged to feed the fastest, most aggressive claims, regardless of reality. Nobody asked me to look deeper into the discrepancy. In fact, my shift supervisor explicitly told me to stop asking questions, to just keep typing the information exactly as it was given and to hit the submit button as fast as possible to meet our nightly quotas. But my brain simply does not function that way. I cannot unsee a fractured foundation once I notice the structural cracks. When my shift ended at dawn on a Friday morning, I did not go home and go to sleep. I bought a large thermos of black coffee, locked myself in my small apartment, opened my personal laptop, and began to build a massive complex map of the invisible disaster unfolding behind the physical one. I stayed awake for the next 48 hours straight. I systematically cross-referenced the claimed structural damage levels against actual satellite, topography, and updated municipal flood maps. I tracked the promised wait times for industrial dehumidifiers, drywall, and lumber against the actual physical density of debris clearing routes. I looked closely at the temporary housing stipends being requested by these emergency contractors and matched them against the physical locations of the billed addresses. The fraud I uncovered was not even particularly sophisticated or clever. It was just incredibly voluminous and brazen. The fake emergencies were acting like a massive coordinated parasite, actively draining millions of dollars from the recovery ecosystem before the real victims could see a single dime to rebuild their lives. I found invoices billing for air quality mitigation in neighborhoods that had never even lost power. I found claims for emergency roof tarps placed on houses that had already been entirely demolished by the city. Driven by a quiet, burning anger, I wrote a comprehensive analytical screening algorithm. It was a raw, brutal piece of logic designed to to automatically strip the artificial priority tags off the fraudulent claims and forcefully elevate the truly uninhabitable properties to the front of the processing line. My model highlighted the impossible logistical coincidences, exposing things like the exact same roofing crew supposedly working 12-hour shifts on 3 different houses separated by 200 m on the exact same Tuesday afternoon. I knew from reading industry trade publications that Kincaid Restoration Holdings was actively drowning under the weight of the storm. They had rapidly absorbed several smaller failing restoration firms right before the hurricane hit, and the sudden influx of corrupted fraudulent data was completely choking their operational capacity. Financial rumors indicated that one of their largest and most crucial regional branches was mere days away from defaulting on massive financial covenants with their primary corporate lenders and commercial insurers. They were bleeding cash, paying out on the fake fast-tracked emergencies while utterly failing to complete the massive legitimate reconstruction jobs. I compiled my entire weekend of manic analysis into a dense, heavily annotated memorandum. I did not have a direct contact at the executive level. I did not know Owen Kincaid from any other wealthy man in a bespoke suit. I simply attached my raw screening model and the explanatory data sets to a blank email and sent it blindly into the general corporate information inbox of his holding company, hoping someone with a brain would open it. I expected nothing in return, and initially that is exactly what I received. There was no automated reply confirming receipt. There was no heartfelt thank you letter printed on thick corporate stationery. No Heil executive recruiter called me to offer a lucrative corner office position when my 90-day temporary contract at Red Bridge Claims Solutions inevitably expired. I handed in my cheap plastic headset, cleared out my small locker, and walked out the door without fanfare. My name vanished instantly into the churning anonymous machine of seasonal disaster employment. I naturally assumed my email had been caught in a strict corporate spam filter or carelessly deleted by a bored administrative intern. I deliberately buried the memory of that exhaustive, sleepless weekend. I moved on with my life. I took out a deeply terrifying small business bank loan, rented a tiny, rundown office space in San Antonio, and began the brutal grinding process of building my own independent consulting firm from absolutely nothing. I spent the next 4 years fighting tooth and nail for small, difficult auditing contracts, slowly building a reputation for finding the money that others missed. I was completely unaware of the massive seed I had blindly planted during the hurricane season. I had absolutely no idea that out of the tens of thousands of frantic messages flooding his corporate servers, Owen Kincaid had somehow personally found and read my solitary analysis. I did not know that my raw data model had become the exact blueprint he used to aggressively purge the parasites from his supply chain, appease his panicked institutional lenders, and forcibly pull his entire company back from the edge of a catastrophic financial abyss. I thought I was just an exhausted temporary worker shouting into a dark void. I never once imagined the king of the empire was actually listening. The mandatory champagne toasts dragged on for another 45 minutes, but the celebratory atmosphere had fractured permanently. I was standing near the exit, contemplating the logistics of calling a private car service to take me back to San Antonio, when a man in a discreet charcoal gray suit touched my left elbow. He introduced himself in a hushed tone as the personal administrative assistant to the patriarch of the Kincaid family. He did not phrase his next sentence as a question. He simply instructed me to follow him, turning on his heel and guiding me away from the sprawling, brightly lit banquet hall. We walked down a long, thickly carpeted private corridor that immediately swallowed the heavy pulsating bass of the wedding band. He opened a set of towering solid mahogany doors and ushered me inside, stepping back into the hallway and pulling the doors firmly shut with a heavy, satisfying click. The sudden silence was absolute. I was standing in the luxury resort's private library. The climate control was turned down to a frigid, aggressively crisp temperature, carrying the rich, distinct scent of expensive leather book bindings, aged wood, and fine cigar smoke. It felt less like a reading room and infinitely more like a high-altitude corporate vault. Standing by a massive unlit stone fireplace holding a fresh crystal glass of scotch, was Owen Kincaid. He did not offer meaningless small talk. He did not ask if I wanted a beverage or if I was enjoying the catered appetizers. He simply gestured to a high-backed leather wing chair positioned across from a heavy oak table. I sat down, keeping my posture rigid, my hands folded neatly in my lap. He began by issuing a flat, thoroughly professional apology for the public spectacle that had occurred less than an hour prior. He stated plainly that no guest should ever be subjected to that kind of localized, deliberate cruelty, especially orchestrated by their own blood relatives. I nodded once, accepting the words, but offering absolutely no vocal absolution from my brother. Then the billionaire's tone shifted instantly from a polite, accommodating host to an apex corporate predator. He explained that he had actually spent the better part of 6 months trying to actively locate me after that specific hurricane season. He stated that the third-party temporary employment agency I had worked for possessed completely catastrophic human resource records. My employment file had been thoroughly mismanaged, my contact information lost during a chaotic database migration, and my identity buried under thousands of transient seasonal contractors. The agency itself had filed for bankruptcy 18 months later, taking all their legacy data down with them. He eventually abandoned the search, logically assuming I had moved on to an entirely different industry. Now, a deeply ironic twist of fate had conveniently delivered me directly to his only daughter's wedding reception. He set his glass on the side table and leaned forward, interlocking his thick fingers. He detailed a massive corporate acquisition his holding company had finalized exactly 12 months ago. They had purchased a sprawling, highly profitable regional firm called Prairie Meridian Adjusting. It was designed to be a massive strategic expansion, a calculated method to absorb and process the rapidly surging volume of severe weather events decimating the southern coastal states. Instead, he confessed it had rapidly become a catastrophic financial hemorrhage. He listed the operational anomalies, speaking of the data points like a seasoned surgeon diagnosing a rapidly spreading terminal illness. He noted that the baseline operational costs for toxic mold remediation within that specific subsidiary had mysteriously spiked by nearly 300% in a single fiscal quarter. Temporary corporate housing invoices for displaced families were consistently being billed out to 90 or even 120 days, completely ignoring the industry's standard 30-day maximum cap. Worse, emergency rapid repair orders were inexplicably duplicating themselves at a mathematically absurd rate. A severely damaged house would receive a high-priority emergency roof tarp on a Tuesday afternoon, and the system would somehow generate an entirely new, fully approved invoice for the exact same tarping service 3 weeks later on the exact same property. He looked at me with a cold, terrifying clarity. On paper, he explained, his internal compliance audits showed the entire operational system functioning flawlessly. The digital vendor signatures matched the databases perfectly. The rigid approval tied by the management software and the standard operating procedures were flawlessly documented and filed. Yet physical reality told a much darker, far more sinister. His private executive-level administrative lines were currently receiving a steadily increasing volume of silent, desperate complaints directly from the affected homeowners. People were calling to tearfully report that their insurance adjusters had officially closed their recovery files, marking the critical structural work as completely satisfied while their actual families were still forced to live inside gutted, half-destroyed residential shells featuring raw plywood subfloors and missing exterior drywall. He frankly confessed that he no longer trusted a single member of his own internal compliance department. The organizational rot was simply too clean, the digital paperwork far too perfect. He strongly suspected the financial fraud was deeply embedded, actively managed, and aggressively protected by someone possessing extremely high-level administrative access to the regional approval routing systems. He did not need another corporate auditor looking to climb the company ladder. He needed a ruthless, independent hunter. He needed someone who did not owe a single executive in his corporate hierarchy a favor. He needed an absolute outsider who naturally looked at a massive enterprise software system the same way a seasoned detective looks at a sprawling complex criminal syndicate network. He reached into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick folded document printed on heavy stock paper. He slid it slowly across the polished oak table between us. It was a blank, highly lucrative independent consulting contract. He promised me absolute, entirely unrestricted administrative access to every single operational file, vendor invoice, bank routing number, and internal communication log inside the newly acquired firm. More importantly, he offered an ironclad, non-negotiable verbal guarantee. He swore that no matter where my analytical data models led, and no matter whose specific name ultimately appeared at the bitter end of the fraudulent money trail, he would not intervene to protect them. He looked me dead in the eye, the heavy silence of the library amplifying his words, and stated clearly that this blanket immunity applied even if the terminal rot extended directly to the man who was currently dancing with his daughter. The lavish million-dollar wedding happening just outside those heavy doors meant absolutely nothing compared to the structural integrity of his life's work. I looked down at the contract resting on the dark wood. The financial retainer fee he had already printed on the second page was genuinely staggering. It was more than enough capital to comfortably secure my small consulting studio's operating budget for the next 5 years. But the money was an entirely secondary calculation in my mind. I understood the true, devastating weight of what was actually happening within his blind spot. This was not a victimless, abstract, white-collar crime committed against a faceless corporation. If a coordinated high-level fraud ring was actively siphoning these specific reconstruction funds, they were literally draining the financial lifeblood out of terrified families who had just lost absolutely everything they owned to a natural disaster. They were systematically stealing from the weakest, most historically vulnerable people imaginable, striking right at the exact moment their entire physical worlds had violently collapsed. I did not accept the contract to finally prove my professional worth to my toxic, dismissive parents. I certainly did not take the job to exact a petty, dramatic soap opera revenge against the arrogant brother who had spent his entire lifetime trying to erase my existence. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting next to the document strictly because this was a fundamental structural crack in the universe that I simply could not walk away from once I had seen the edges of the fracture. I signed my full legal name in a smooth, dark line, legally binding myself to the hunt. I slid the thick paper back across the polished table. The heavy mahogany doors were firmly locked behind me, and the meticulously calculated execution of my brother's empire had officially begun. I drove the 270-mile back to San Antonio in absolute silence, the heavy weight of the signed contract sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. The moment I unlocked the door to my small, dimly lit office, I bypassed the light switches and went straight to my secure workstations. Owen Kincaid had executed his promise with terrifying efficiency. By Monday morning, a dedicated, heavily encrypted data pipeline had opened directly into my local servers. It flooded my arrays with the entire, unfiltered operational history of Prairie Meridian, adjusting since the corporate acquisition. It was a staggering, chaotic mountain of digital information. I spent the first 48 hours doing absolutely nothing but ingesting and organizing the raw chaos. I needed to see the skeleton beneath the skin. I built a massive interconnected relational database. I meticulously linked every single vendor invoice to its corresponding municipal repair permit. I cross-referenced high-resolution aerial drone photography with the handwritten field inspection reports. I tied the lucrative temporary hotel rental agreements directly to the daily scheduling logs of the physical construction crews. I turned my multiple monitors into a sprawling digital map of the devastated southern coastal region, stepping back to let the raw data dictate the narrative. The active hunting phase began late Tuesday night when the rest of the city was asleep. I started by running a basic broad-spectrum statistical variance check on the initial property damage assessments. The analytical software chewed through the files and almost immediately flagged a glaring mathematically impossible anomaly. I leaned closer to the screen, scrolling rapidly through hundreds of individual residential property files. These homes were scattered across 7 entirely different coastal counties. They faced different wind directions, set at vastly different geographic elevations and suffered wildly varying degrees of structural compromise from the storm. Yet, every single one of these hundreds of files recorded the exact same baseline interior humidity reading. They all listed 92.4%. In the chaotic, highly unpredictable physical reality of post-disaster environments, that level of statistical uniformity does not exist. It was a lazy, arrogant copy-and-paste job executed on a massive industrial scale. Driven by the thrill of the chase, I dug much deeper into the labor routing logs and the GPS vehicle tracking data. I quickly uncovered miracles of modern transportation that defied the laws of physics. According to the approved billing invoices, a specialized roofing crew charging a premium emergency hourly rate successfully finished a massive structural tarping job in Galveston at exactly 2:00 in the afternoon. Exactly 1 hour later, that very same six-man crew supposedly clocked in to begin a hazardous debris removal operation on a completely different property located 300 m away in Corpus Christi. They were billing the holding company for heavy physical labor in two completely separate disaster zones simultaneously. Curious about the origins of these superhuman emergency contractors, I ran their corporate registration details through the state tax and licensing database. The results were darkly predictable and infuriating. The registered corporate addresses for these highly paid top-tier emergency response teams were not sprawling equipment yards, active lumber warehouses, or legitimate office parks. They were obscure anonymous mailboxes rented at generic strip mall shipping stores. Some were simply listed at commercial storefronts that had been abandoned and boarded up for years. As I fed more queries into the system, a distinct, incredibly lucrative financial rhythm began to emerge from the noise. I noticed three specific billing categories constantly traveling together, forming a highly protected, completely unassailable trinity of corporate theft. Almost every single suspicious file I flagged featured the maximum allowed emergency charges for air quality mitigation, temporary roofing, and accelerated permit handling. This specific combination was a masterclass in bureaucratic camouflage. It artificially inflated the cost of every single insurance claim by tens of thousands of dollars. Yet, it appeared entirely legitimate to a bored, overworked desk adjuster staring at a computer screen 5 states away. But the most sickening, visceral discovery came just before dawn when I cross-referenced the corporate completion metrics against the actual city engineering databases. I found a massive concentrated cluster of residential files officially marked as fully restored and financially closed within the Kincaid internal systems. The shell company contractors had been paid in full. The insurance providers had settled the claims. The corporate ledgers showed total success. However, when I forcefully pinged the corresponding municipal building departments for the public records, the mandatory final inspection reports were completely missing. The city structural engineers and electrical inspectors had never visited the properties to sign off on the safety of the work. I pulled up the latest satellite imagery for a dozen of these supposedly completed addresses. The physical reality washed over me like ice water. I was looking at aerial photographs of collapsed roofs with shredded blue tarps flapping in the wind, surrounded by overgrown yards filled with rotting debris. Someone deep inside the system was actively authorizing massive finalized payouts for homes that had never actually been touched by a single hammer. They were generating immense, untraceable wealth off the ghosts of ruined houses. They were leaving the actual families permanently trapped in toxic, half-destroyed shells, financially abandoning them, while the disaster relief funds quietly vanished into a labyrinth of fake accounts. I realized then that this was not a loose collection of random accounting errors. It was not the isolated work of a few rogue opportunistic contractors skimming off the top of a chaotic situation. This was a highly sophisticated, deeply entrenched underground toll system built entirely upon human suffering. Every single fake emergency file acted as a deliberate, calculated straw plunged deep into the recovery fund. I needed to find the architect. I began to painstakingly trace the digital signatures attached to the final payment authorizations, working my way backward through the labyrinth. The approval chain was incredibly complex, deliberately designed with multiple blind alleys to obscure the final destination. But data always leaves a trail, and this trail inevitably funneled upward to a single-high administrative choke point. The name attached to the ultimate corporate green light was Mason Quill. He was the chief operating officer of the entire Kincaid conglomerate. Finding the second in command of the empire was a massive revelation, but it did not explain the sheer granular operational speed of the fraud within the newly acquired regional branch. Quill was far too high up the corporate ladder to manually manage the daily manipulation of the localized routing queues and the specific vendor assignments. He was the shield, but he absolutely needed an operator on the ground. He needed someone who understood the new integration software perfectly. I wrote an aggressive new script designed to isolate the parallel administrative privileges running silently alongside Quill's executive overrides. I was hunting for the specific user account that was manually forcing fraudulent field files past the automated internal compliance checks. The query ran for 1,010 minutes. The cooling fans on my servers screamed in the quiet office. Then the result populated on my primary screen. I froze, the breath catching sharply in my throat. The digital signature authorizing the unholy trinity of fake charges. The exact user account approving the impossible. Duplicated humidity readings and the master administrative key unlocking the final. Massive payments for the untouched. Destroyed homes all belonged to the exact same person. The corporate title listed in the directory was Lead Post-Merger Integration Manager. The name attached to the master account was Grant Rodriguez. The shock was absolute, a cold, heavy stone dropping perfectly into the pit of my stomach. My brother was not just hovering on the lucrative periphery of this disaster. He was not merely a passive beneficiary blindly enjoying the financial spoils of a corrupt corporate culture. He was the core engine of the theft. He had used his newly appointed position to bridge the gap between the chaotic old regional systems and the massive new Kincaid corporate treasury. He held the keys to the entire routing network. He was sitting at the absolute dead center of the approval matrix, personally orchestrating the systematic, ruthless robbery of thousands of desperate families, all while wearing a bespoke tuxedo and smiling for the cameras. The bell above the frosted glass door of my office chimed shortly after 2:00 on a Thursday afternoon. I did not look up from the glare of my monitors, assuming it was the local courier service dropping off another heavy box of physical receipts. A dense, expensive cologne suddenly overwhelmed the scent of stale coffee in the small room. I turned my chair and found my brother standing perfectly still in the center of my worn carpet. He looked wildly out of place. His bespoke navy suit clashed aggressively with my battered metal filing cabinets and the exposed brick walls of my modest workspace. He did not start the conversation with demands or threats. He deployed the classic, deeply manipulative sibling routine that had worked for him his entire life. He leaned casually against the edge of my desk, flashed a relaxed, disarming smile, and told me we needed to have a private talk, just brother and sister. He casually waved his hand through the air, completely dismissing the catastrophic humiliation he had orchestrated at the reception. He claimed the entire introduction was simply an awkward attempt at an icebreaker. He insisted he was just trying to cut through the stiff, pretentious atmosphere of the billionaire crowd, and that I was taking a harmless, off-the-cuff joke far too seriously. I let him speak. I listened to the smooth cadence of his voice, the practiced rhythm of the man who sold lies for a living. When he finally ran out of breath and waited for my absolution, I did not offer anger. I offered absolute chilling precision. I calmly listed the identical moisture readings spanning 7 distinct counties. I mentioned the phantom roofing crews billing for simultaneous labor hundreds of miles apart. I described the exact sequence of the accelerated municipal handling fees attached to completely gutted abandoned properties. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying to witness. The patronizing, arrogant smirk simply evaporated from his face. His jaw muscles tightened so severely that the skin around his cheekbones pulled taut. He was no longer looking at the family disappointment. He was staring at a legitimate, highly credible threat to his newly acquired empire. The relaxed posture vanished, replaced by the coiled tension of a cornered predator. He immediately shifted tactics, abandoning the apology and pivoting to aggressive gaslighting. He leaned aggressively over my desk, planting both hands flat on the scratched wood. He told me that I did not understand the physical reality of a disaster zone. He argued that the entire industry was inherently chaotic, built on rushed decisions and messy paperwork. He insisted I was confusing basic administrative incompetence with a grand criminal conspiracy. He said I was looking at ghosts. Then he dropped the real question, the only inquiry that actually mattered to him. His voice lost all its warmth. Dropping into a cold, flat register, he asked me exactly how far up the chain my data had gone. He demanded to know precisely what I had already shown to his new father-in-law. I stared blankly back at him, offering absolutely nothing. I let the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. He held my gaze for 10 agonizing seconds before turning on his heel and walking out, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind him. The psychological siege truly began. Later that evening, my phone vibrated across my kitchen counter precisely at 8:00. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I answered, and immediately Alina was weeping. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a loud theatrical display of maternal panic. She begged me to stop whatever I was doing. She sobbed into the receiver, telling me that I was actively trying to destroy the absolute best thing that had ever happened to our family. She spoke as if my silence was the mandatory tax I had to pay to ensure their collective happiness. She framed my professional investigation as an act of petty, jealous sabotage aimed directly at her golden child. Before I could form a proper response, the line shuffled and my father took the phone. Hector did not yell. He used that low moralizing tone he reserved for moments of profound disappointment. He told me that family always protects family regardless of the circumstances. He lectured me about loyalty, stating that sometimes a person simply has to close their eyes to certain unpleasant realities for the greater good of their own blood. He firmly ordered me not to turn a few confusing spreadsheets into a real physical disaster that would ruin us all. The sheer intensity of their defense confused me. They had always favored him. This frantic, desperate panic felt tangibly different. It felt like absolute terror, driven by a sudden, dark suspicion. I opened a new browser window while my father continued to lecture me about familial duty. I logged directly into the county property tax registry and pulled up the public financial records for my parents' suburban home. The truth glared back at me from the screen in stark, undeniable black and white. For the past 5 years, they had been drowning under a massive, heavily refinanced mortgage. They had been months behind on their payments, constantly hovering on the absolute brink of foreclosure. But precisely 3 weeks ago, right as the wedding preparations reached their peak, a massive lump sum payment had miraculously cleared the entire debt. I checked the routing origin of the payoff. It was not a personal check from my brother's bank account. The funds had been wired directly from a corporate holding account belonging to one of the most prolific phantom contracting firms currently sitting at the very center of my fraud map. The breath left my lungs. He had not just bought their loyalty. He had purchased their absolute, unquestioning survival using stolen disaster relief money. My parents were financially and psychologically chained to his success. If he fell, he was taking their home, their security, and their entire fabricated reality down with him. They were completely trapped, and they were willing to sacrifice me to keep the walls of their comfortable prison intact. The pressure rapidly escalated from emotional manipulation to direct calculated intimidation. 2 days later, a thick, heavy envelope arrived via certified courier. It was printed on the expensive watermarked stationery of a highly aggressive corporate defense firm based in Houston. It was not a lawsuit, but it was a very clear, thinly veiled threat. The letter politely reminded me of the severe legal and financial penalties associated with corporate defamation, cautious interference, and the reckless handling of proprietary data. It was a shot across the bow designed to make me reconsider my life choices. Then the digital attacks began. My network firewall began logging hundreds of unauthorized intrusion attempts. They hit my servers primarily between 2 and 4 in the morning. Relentless automated pings, constantly searching for a weak port or an unpatched vulnerability. Someone was aggressively trying to blind me, attempting to breach my local arrays and wipe the assembled evidence completely clean. The final warning was entirely physical, completely devoid of digital distance. I arrived at my office early on a Tuesday morning to find a small generic black flash drive sitting perfectly centered on my welcome mat. There was no note attached. It was completely blank. It was a silent, incredibly loud message stating that they knew exactly where I worked. They knew my physical routines, and they could reach out and touch me whenever they decided the time was right. They expected me to panic. They calculated that the combined weight of family betrayal, legal threats, and physical intimidation would force me to abandon the contract and retreat back into my quiet, obscure corner of the world. They severely miscalculated. Instead of backing down, I went entirely dark. I immediately disconnected my primary evidence servers from the external internet, creating a completely isolated, air-gapped environment. I purchased massive encrypted external hard drives with cache. I copied every single fraudulent invoice, every fake municipal permit, and every impossible vehicle log onto these offline drives. I meticulously built a comprehensive chronological timeline of the entire criminal enterprise, linking every single stolen dollar directly back to my brother's digital signature. I printed hundreds of pages of hard evidence, organizing the physical documents into heavy fireproof lock. I secured these locks in a private anonymous bank vault completely detached from my personal identity. I ensured that even if they managed to completely destroy my office, burn my servers to the ground, or physically remove me from the equation, the truth would survive. The trap was no longer just digital. It was buried deep, utterly indestructible, and patiently waiting for the absolute perfect moment to snap shut. A text message arrived on my secured secondary phone late on a Tuesday afternoon. The sender was an entirely unregistered number, but the brief message contained a very specific reference to the heavy mahogany doors of the private library at the resort. Only 3 people on Earth knew about that specific meeting. The sender was the bride. Delaney requested a face-to-face conversation at a completely unremarkable, aggressively beige coffee shop located on the far west side of San Antonio. She made one thing explicitly clear in her final sentence. She was reaching out to me strictly in her capacity as the daughter of Owen Kincaid, not as the newly minted wife of Grant Rodriguez. I arrived at the designated location exactly 45 minutes early. I ordered a bitter black coffee, chose a secluded booth facing the primary entrance, and meticulously scanned every single person walking through the door. In my line of work, paranoia is simply a survival mechanism. When Delaney finally walked in, she was virtually unrecognizable from the radiant, diamond-draped woman I had seen at the reception. She wore a plain khaki trench coat, dark sunglasses, and her hair was pulled back into a severe utilitarian knot. She looked like a woman actively bracing for an explosion. She slid into the vinyl booth directly opposite me, placing a heavy leather tote bag onto the scratch table between us. She did not bother with pleasantries or polite small talk. The tension radiating off her was thick, jagged, and impossible to ignore. Every slight movement she made felt calculated, as if she were stepping through an active minefield. She started by addressing the brutal incident at the banquet. She looked me directly in the eyes and confessed that the public humiliation my brother had orchestrated made her feel physically nauseous. She stated that watching him parade me around as a family failure was the exact moment his perfectly polished golden facade finally cracked in her mind. But she quickly admitted that the deep chilling unease had actually started planting roots many weeks before the ceremony ever took place. Delaney leaned closer, keeping her voice completely level and barely above a whisper. She detailed how my brother had become aggressively, almost feverishly obsessed with the immediate combination of their legal estates. He had pushed relentlessly to finalize their joint asset declarations long before the invitations were even printed. She revealed a detail that immediately set off every single alarm bell in my analytical mind. Grant had actively manipulated the entire wedding timeline. He had manufactured a dozen fake logistical emergencies regarding venue availability and catering contracts just to violently push the date forward by exactly 6 months. She explained that a massive, highly confidential corporate board restructuring was scheduled, to take place during the upcoming financial quarter. This specific restructuring was designed to grant legal spouses of board members indirect voting rights and massive equity access through the primary family trust. My brother had dragged her to the altar in a frantic sprint solely to ensure he possessed a legal ring on his finger before that specific board meeting commenced. She reached into her heavy leather bag and pulled out a thin manila folder, sliding it carefully across the table. Inside were photocopies of the master wedding budget ledgers. She pointed a manicured finger at several massive 6F figurura expenditures listed under vague catering and floral consultation fees. Delaney told me she had grown suspicious after noticing Grant taking hushed, highly aggressive phone calls with these supposed wedding vendors late at night, long after he thought she was asleep. Driven by a gut instinct she could not suppress, she had manually compared those specific corporate billing addresses against the state commercial registry. The addresses for the luxury wedding planners perfectly matched the exact same abandoned strip malls, empty lots, and fake postal boxes used by the phantom emergency response teams I was currently investigating. He had brazenly used their lavish, multi-million-dollar wedding budget as a perfectly clean, highly visible smoke screen to quietly launder the fraudulent contractor payouts directly into his own hidden accounts. I sat perfectly still, staring at the photocopied ledgers. The air in the coffee shop felt incredibly heavy. I did not immediately embrace her as an ally. My entire life had been defined by people wearing carefully constructed masks, and my brother was an absolute master at recruiting willing accomplices. I looked up from the papers and asked her point blank why I should believe a single word she was saying. I told her bluntly that she could easily be a scout sent directly by my brother to figure out exactly what evidence I possessed and how close I was to tearing his operation apart. I needed to know if she was a lifeline or just another elaborately constructed trap. Delaney did not flinch at my accusation. She did not act insulted or try to defend her honor. Instead, her expression hardened into a mask of pure, cold resolve. She simply reached back into her bag and withdrew a second, much thicker document printed on heavy legal paper. She placed it squarely in front of me. It was an official legal addendum to their prenuptial agreement. She explained that Grant had been relentlessly pressuring her to sign this specific document in the days immediately following the wedding ceremony. He had repeatedly dismissed it as standard administrative housekeeping, insisting it was just a boring legal formality required by his new corporate position. I opened the heavy document and began reading. Hidden deep beneath thick layers of dense, intentionally confusing legal jargon was a single terrifying clause. It stipulated that in the highly specific event of a sudden medical emergency incapacitating the current company patriarch, my brother would instantly be granted temporary unilateral signatory power over all critical operational decisions regarding the holding company and its subsidiary branches. Delaney watched my eyes scan the text, waiting for the realization to set in. Then she quietly informed me of a closely guarded, highly sensitive family secret. Her father was not just stressed or overworked. Owen Kincaid was scheduled to undergo a highly invasive mandatory heart surgery in exactly 3 weeks. The operation was severe. He would be heavily sedated, medically incapacitated, and entirely out of communication for a minimum of 1 full month while he recovered in a secure private facility. Along with the legal addendum, Delaney handed me a small encrypted digital drive. She stated it contained thousands of internal emails and secure messages she had secretly downloaded from Grant's private home office computer while he was away at a mandatory golf retreat. She had seen the massive invisible cage he was systematically building around her entire family, and she was handing me the exact keys to tear it down. The final, terrifying puzzle pieces slammed violently into place, completely altering my entire perception of the battlefield. The sheer scale of his ambition was breathtaking. I looked at the legal documents, the financial ledgers, and the encrypted drive, the blood running absolutely cold in my veins. My brother was not just skimming a few $1 million off the top of a messy, chaotic disaster relief fund. He was not a simple opportunistic thief looking for a quick payday. He was a corporate parasite executing a flawless hostile takeover from the inside. The lavish, perfectly choreographed marriage was never his ultimate destination. Delaney was not a wife to him. She was an access code. The wedding was merely the final necessary tool designed to completely legalize an aggressive corporate coup through perfectly clean, unassailable paperwork. He was deliberately positioning himself to seize total control of the entire throne while the king was unconscious and bleeding on an operating table. The long game was power, absolute and unchecked, and I was the only person standing in the dark with a match. I possessed enough raw data to detonate my brother's carefully constructed reality, but I did not immediately submit my final report to the executive board. In the high-stakes ecosystem of corporate fraud, striking prematurely is a fatal amateur error. You do not merely present suspicious spreadsheets to a room full of powerful people. You must build an inescapable legal cage. I established a heavily encrypted communication channel directly with Owen Kincaid, operating entirely outside his compromised internal network. We quietly retained a notoriously aggressive corporate litigation firm out of Chicago. Simultaneously, we brought in an independent forensic banking specialist, a man who spent his life tracing the labyrinth of stolen cash through offshore holding accounts and anonymous corporate shells. We were quietly assembling an execution squad. However, to make the charges stick, we needed the architects of this theft to actively reveal themselves in real time. Criminals are incredibly cautious when they believe they are safe, but they make catastrophic, highly visible mistakes when they panic. I needed to engineer a very specific localized panic. Early on a Wednesday morning, I utilized my master administrative credentials to plant a highly classified internal memorandum deep into the primary corporate routing system. The document officially mandated a sudden randomized federal compliance audit of 200 specific coastal recovery files, citing credible suspicions of severe material price gouging. I intentionally left a minuscule security vulnerability in the memo's routing permissions, ensuring it would immediately trigger the automated keyword alerts monitored by the executive suite. It was the digital equivalent of dropping a bleeding piece of bait into shark-infested waters. The reaction was virtually instantaneous and utterly spectacular to observe. I sat in my darkened office nursing a cup of coffee, watching my secondary monitors light up with real-time access logs. Within exactly 2 hours of the memo dropping, the corporate system went into a state of absolute silent hysteria. My screens tracked dozens of unauthorized executive login targeting the exact coastal files I had artificially flagged. The digital footprints they left behind were incredibly clumsy, driven entirely by adrenaline. They were frantically submitting retroactive requests to alter finalized vendor invoices. They were desperately attempting to delete attached inspection photographs that proved the houses were still destroyed. They were aggressively moving vast quantities of archived data out of obscure, long-forgotten operational folders that normally saw zero traffic. It was a digital stampede. The most significant unforced error came directly from the top of the pyramid. By 1:00 in the afternoon, Mason Quill, acting in his supreme capacity as chief operating officer, bypassed 3 separate financial security protocols to personally authorize a massive emergency capital transfer. He moved millions of dollars out of the primary operational accounts and buried the funds deep inside a newly established, highly opaque contingency trust. It was the exact, undeniable reflex of a guilty man frantically trying to hide the murder weapon before the sirens arrived. The trap had worked flawlessly. Then my secured phone rang, shattering the quiet hum of my server racks. It was Grant. He did not bother with his usual charismatic, perfectly polished introduction. His voice was incredibly tight, vibrating with a barely contained, furious energy. He had clearly discovered my clandestine meeting with his new wife. He immediately launched into a vicious, highly calculated character assassination of Delaney. He told me she was deeply unstable, prone to wild, paranoid delusions fueled by the massive stress of the corporate merger and her father's failing health. He lowered his voice into a suffocating conspiratorial whisper, warning me that if I actually believed her manic conspiracy theories, I was walking blindly into a massive psychological trap. He vehemently insisted she was just a spoiled, vindictive eyes trying to use me, to leverage her own financial position against him within the family trust. He played the role of the deeply concerned older brother, trying to save his naive sister from a manipulative outsider. I did not argue with his lies. I did not offer a single emotional reaction, neither confirming nor denying his accusations. I simply let him talk, allowing the dead air on the line to amplify his growing, desperate paranoia. While he desperately tried to manipulate my perception of reality, my hands were moving rapidly across my keyboard. I was not just passively watching them alter the corporate files. I was actively mirroring their servers. Every single time Grant or Mason attempted to scrub a fraudulent address or delete a fake material invoice, my localized air-gapped system captured the exact timestamp of the alteration. I was permanently freezing both their original lie and their panicked secondary cover-up. I was actively transforming their frantic attempts at concealment into the absolute most legally damning evidence of the entire investigation. The final transition from abstract data to visceral, human reality occurred exactly 2 days later. Up until this point, the fraud had been a collection of mathematical impossibilities. I needed a physical witness, someone whose professional identity had been stolen to facilitate the grand illusion. I tracked down a regional field manager named Tessa Rowan. She was a veteran structural inspector, known throughout the industry for her brutal honesty and meticulous paperwork. We met in the back of a brightly lit, unremarkable diner on the outskirts of Houston. I did not waste time with small talk. I slid a thick stack of printed municipal completion certificates across the sticky laminate table. Every single document bore her distinct digital signature, officially declaring that extensive complex structural repairs had been flawlessly completed on dozens of severely flooded residential homes. Tessa picked up the first page, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. As she flipped through the subsequent documents, the confusion rapidly morphed into pure unadulterated outrage. Her face turned incredibly pale, her hands trembling slightly as she dropped the papers back onto the table. She stared directly at me and stated categorically that she had never visited a single one of those addresses. She had never authorized those specific, highly expensive repairs, and she had certainly never applied her binding legal signature to those certificates. Her entire professional integrity had been hijacked by my brother's network to push the fake claims past the city regulators. The true, devastating gravity of the situation completely settled over us in that small diner booth. This was no longer just an abstract puzzle of mathematical anomalies or suspicious corporate data points. It was not merely an intellectual game played on glowing monitors in a dark room. The fraud had violently breached the digital realm. My brother and his network had actively stolen the professional identities of real hardworking people to rubber stamp their massive theft. They were brazenly forging legal documents to actively deceive the state government. And most horrifying of all, at the very bitter end of those forged signatures were real American families. These were real people still living in the toxic, mold-infested ruins of their destroyed homes, completely financially abandoned by a system that had already marked their properties as perfectly saved. The hunt was officially over. It was time for the final execution. The invitation arrived exactly 48 hours before the emergency executive board session was scheduled to convene in Dallas. It was not a formal summon from a corporate lawyer or an aggressive legal threat. It was a frantic, emotionally charged voicemail from my mother, begging me to come to my childhood home for one last quiet family dinner. She claimed we simply needed to sit down together under one roof, just the four of us, and talk things through like a real family before everything was permanently broken. I knew exactly what was waiting for me behind their familiar front door. It was not a meal. It was a highly calculated psychological ambush. I arrived at precisely 7:00 in the evening. The suburban dining room smelled intensely of roasted meat and heavy, suffocating desperation. Nobody made a move to touch the food, sitting entirely cold on the fine china. The atmosphere in the room was as dense and toxic as a sealed tomb. My father sat rigidly at the head of the heavy oak table, his face a mask of grim righteous indignation. My mother was already crying silently, dabbing at her eyes with a white linen napkin before a single word had even been spoken. Grant was seated directly across from me. He had deliberately shed his intimidating corporate armor for the evening. He wore a soft, uncharacteristically simple gray sweater, his posture slightly slumped, projecting the meticulously crafted image of an exhausted, deeply humbled man. He was playing the role of the prodigal son seeking redemption, and my parents were his fiercely devoted audience. The dinner instantly transformed into a brutal family tribunal. Elena started the assault, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. She looked at me with red accusing eyes and explicitly stated that if my corporate report reached the boardroom, I would be entirely responsible for destroying my own parents. She weaponized a recently paid-off mortgage, completely ignoring the fact that it was settled with stolen disaster funds. She wailed that they would lose their house, their community standing, and every single shred of dignity they possessed in their twilight years. Hector immediately reinforced her hysterics with his heavy moralizing baritone. He leaned over his untouched plate and firmly told me that there are invisible lines a person simply does not cross when blood is involved. He demanded to know how I could sleep at night, knowing I was about to single-handedly ruin my own flesh and blood over a few confusing spreadsheets and corporate regulations. They built a massive, suffocating wall of guilt, designing every sentence to make me feel like a cruel, ungrateful monster systematically destroying a loving home. Then, having let his loyal soldiers soften the target, Grant finally spoke. His voice was incredibly smooth, gentle, and utterly laced with poison. He looked deeply into my eyes and offered a breathtakingly manipulative confession. He admitted that he might have gone just a little too far during the chaotic, high-pressure period immediately following the corporate merger. He painted himself as a brilliant but stressed executive who merely cut a few administrative corners to ensure the disaster victims got their money faster. He actively framed the massive systemic fraud network as a simple, innocent misunderstanding born of sheer operational chaos. He promised me that if I simply amended my final audit, he would personally issue a quiet internal apology to the compliance department and make sure the accounts were gradually balanced. He did not ask me to bury the report entirely. He was far too smart for that. He just needed me to alter the vocabulary. He gently asked me to change the word fraud to the phrase operational complexity. He needed me to downgrade a massive federal crime into a minor procedural deviation to sweeten the poison. He slid his ultimate bait across the table. He leaned forward and promised me a senior executive position within his newly consolidated division. He guaranteed a massive 7-figure annual salary, total autonomy over my own department, and genuine unrestricted corporate power. But the most insidious part of his offer was not the money. It was the emotional validation. He looked at our parents, then back at me, and softly stated that if we solved this problem together, we could finally be a real united team. For the absolute first time in my 35 years of existence, my golden brother was openly offering me a seat at the head table and the unconditional pride of my family. I did not yell. I did not throw my watered glass in his face or dramatically storm out of the dining room. I sat perfectly still and offered him absolute, unbroken silence. I let the quiet stretch out for 1 minute, then 2. In the high-stakes game of negotiation, silence is a terrifying vacuum, and arrogant men possess a fatal compulsion to fill it. Grant watched my blank expression, desperately searching for a sign that his emotional manipulation was working. Believing my silence was hesitation, he pushed just a little harder, and in doing so, he completely slipped off his carefully constructed mask. His gentle, repentant tone hardened into a cold, cynical edge. He let out a short, dismissive scoff and leaned back in his chair. He looked at me with genuine condescension and bluntly stated that during massive hurricane years, every single person takes a little piece of the pie. He confidently declared that the government expects the shrinkage, the insurers write it off, and only a complete naive fool genuinely believes that clean hands exist in a disaster zone. He essentially confessed that the suffering of thousands of people was nothing more than a profitable, universally accepted business model to him. I slowly stood up from the table, picking up my purse. I looked down at my mother, who was still clutching her napkin, and my father, who was staring at me with cold, expectant eyes. Finally, I looked at Grant, who was wearing a confident, self-satisfied smirk, entirely convinced he had successfully bought my compliance. I told them simply that the dinner was over, turned my back on my family, and walked out the front door into the cool night air. Grant remained at the table, completely unaware that tucked deeply inside the inner pocket of my leather purse was a high-fidelity digital audio recorder. Every single tear, every threat, and his arrogant, unprompted confession about taking a little piece of the disaster funds had been captured with crystal-clear acoustic precision. I drove away from my childhood home, leaving him fully convinced he still controlled the board, possessed my silence, and had a very real chance to win the war. The absolute final piece of the execution narrative fell directly into my hands at 3:00 that same morning. I was sitting in my dark office reviewing the audio files when my encrypted phone illuminated. It was Delaney. Her voice on the line was shaking, not with fear but with a cold, terrifying rage. She told me she had been unable to sleep and had decided to dig deeply into her own personal cloud storage backups. She had been cross-referencing the exact dates of the massive unauthorized capital transfers Mason Quill had initiated earlier in the week. She noticed a horrifying correlation. During their incredibly brief 3-day honeymoon in Cabo, there was a specific 4-hour window where Grant had claimed he was taking a nap in their private villa. Delaney had left her personal phone resting on the bedside table while she went down to the beach. She had just pulled the deeply buried digital security logs from her device. History. During that exact 4-hour window, her phone had intercepted and silently deleted 6 highly secure two-factor authentication text messages generated directly by the Kincaid corporate treasury system. The revelation was absolute and entirely devastating. Grant had not just manipulated his wife for her proximity to power. He had waited until she was out of the room, bypassed her biometric security locks, and actively used her personal device to securely authorize the massive emergency disbursements to his phantom contractor network. The digital signatures attached to those stolen millions were not his. They belonged entirely to Delaney. He had not just stolen from her family. He had meticulously and deliberately forged a digital paper trail designed to frame his own bride for the entire federal crime. If the state regulators or the internal auditors ever discovered the missing millions, the irrefutable digital evidence would lead the federal investigators directly to the billionaire's daughter, leaving Grant completely clean to seize control of the forloat. It was the ultimate unforgivable betrayal, and it provided the exact, lethal ammunition we needed for the upcoming morning. The closed-door executive session convened precisely at 9 in the morning inside the towering glass boardroom at the Dallas headquarters of Kincaid Restoration Holdings. The atmosphere was sterile, heavily pressurized, and entirely devoid of any social warmth. Gathered around the massive polished mahogany table were the 7 senior members of the board of directors, 3 aggressive outside corporate legal counsels, our independent forensic banking expert, Owen, Delaney, Mason Quill, Grant, and myself. I did not open my presentation with emotional grievances or dramatic complaints about the humiliating wedding reception. In this room, emotions were a severe liability. I stood at the head of the long table, lowered the ambient lighting, and immediately projected a massive, undeniable cash flow diagram onto the primary viewing screen. I systematically traced the complete life cycle of a single exploited disaster claim. I visually guided the board from the initial structural damage report submitted by a desperate homeowner straight to the immediate assignment of a phantom contractor through the heavily inflated emergency reserve fund withdrawal. And finally, I highlighted the deliberate funneling of that exact money through a complex series of intermediary corporate entities registered under the name Laurel Pike. I spoke with cold, absolute precision. I proved conclusively to the silent room that this was not a loose collection of random administrative accounting errors or isolated incidents of local greed. It was a masterfully structured parasitic system designed from the top down. They were artificially manufacturing catastrophic emergencies, criminally inflating basic repair costs, prematurely closing active recovery files, and then aggressively siphoning the resulting massive profits into non-existent consulting services. Grant immediately attempted to launch a desperate counteroffensive. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face was flushed with panicked anger. the golden boy facade completely shattering under the weight of the hard dater. He desperately tried to paint me to the board as a deeply bitter, fundamentally jealous younger sister. He claimed I was fabricating a complex corporate conspiracy simply because I felt socially marginalized by my wealthy family and wanted to ruin his new marriage. I did not argue with his frantic character assassination. I did not raise my voice to defend my professional integrity. I simply reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out my digital audio recorder, and pressed play. His own voice filled the silent boardroom, echoing sharply off the cold glass walls. Every single executive listened closely as Grant smoothly offered me a high-level executive title and millions of dollars in exchange for my total silence. They heard him explicitly instruct me to change the word fraud to the phrase operational complexity in my final audit. And then the room grew deathly still as they heard his ultimate damning confession. His recorded voice stated confidently that during massive disaster years, absolutely everyone takes a little piece of the pie, and that clean hands simply do not exist in the real world. The color completely drained from Mason Quill's face. The chief operating officer frantically tried to pivot his defense, stammering rapidly about a massive executive misunderstanding and placing the blame entirely on rogue regional managers who had abused the integration software. But our forensic banking expert smoothly intervened, completely shutting down that escape route. He distributed thick stacks of verified financial ledgers to every person at the table. He proved definitively that massive disguised retainer fees had consistently flowed directly through the Laurel Pike shell companies and immediately routed back into private offshore networks exclusively controlled by both Mason and Grant. The paper trail was absolute and legally binding. Before Grant could formulate another desperate lie, Delaney stood up from her chair. She did not look at him with sorrow, heartbreak, or any trace of the love she had shown on their wedding day. She looked at him with absolute freezing disgust. She projected the verified authentication logs from her personal mobile device directly onto the screen right next to my cash flow diagram. She clearly and methodically explained to the horrified board how Grant had secretly utilized her phone during their extremely brief honeymoon to bypass corporate treasury security protocols. She proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had deliberately forged her digital signature to authorize the largest emergency capital disbursements. Her presentation completely confirmed that he had actively prepared his own new wife to serve as the ultimate federal scapegoat when the internal auditors inevitably came looking for the missing millions. The final devastating strike was delivered remotely. I initiated a highly secure encrypted video conference call with Tessa Rowan. The veteran field manager appeared on the screen looking directly at the camera and categorically stated to the entire executive board that her official signature had been systematically and repeatedly forged on hundreds of municipal completion certificates. She confirmed the horrifying human reality of the financial baiter. She told the room that countless houses were officially marked as fully restored and structurally sound in the corporate ledgers, while the actual families were still living right now amongst damp, toxic walls, temporary plastic roofs, and massive unpaid recovery bills. Owen Kincaid sat at the head of the table, his posture incredibly rigid, his hands folded tightly together. He did not look at Grant as a highly prized son-in-law or a brilliant corporate strategist bringing fresh energy to the firm. He looked at him as a deeply repulsive parasite who had actively constructed a highly lucrative casino directly on top of the shattered ruins of desperate suffering people. Owen did not hesitate for a single second. He immediately ordered his legal team to freeze every single internal financial account tied to the post-merger division. He commanded the physical seizure of all local routing servers and employee communication devices. Without leaving the room, he instructed his outside counsel to formally notify the primary insurance carriers, the massive institutional lenders, and the state attorney general to initiate a massive immediate criminal investigation. Delaney calmly slid her heavy, floorless diamond wedding ring off her finger. The soft clink of the metal hitting the polished mahogany table sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Her voice was completely steady and completely devoid of any regret as she publicly announced her intention to file for an immediate emergency annulment and divorce. She cited egregious financial fraud, extreme deception, and malicious document forgery. In a matter of seconds, Grant's highly calculated promotion by marriage violently collapsed into absolute, unrecoverable ruin right before his eyes. The subsequent shockwave of the total asset freeze was instantaneous and brutal. Within hours, the stolen funds used to secretly satisfy my parents' severely overdue mortgage were officially flagged and locked by the federal financial investigators. Elena and Hector finally realized that the miraculous financial rescue they had so deeply worshiped, the money that had saved their precious social standing, was built entirely on dirty, stolen disaster funds. The comfortable, perfect illusion they had violently protected was completely gone, leaving them dangerously exposed to severe financial ruin, federal scrutiny, and massive public disgrace. I did not rush back to their suburban home to offer comfort, legal advice, or financial solutions. I stood my ground, remaining completely detached and utterly silent, allowing them to finally experience the devastating real-world consequences of always choosing the son who manufactured a comfortable lie over the daughter who simply told the difficult truth. When the boardroom finally cleared out and the federal authorities began arriving in the expansive marble lobby downstairs, Owen turned to me in the quiet room. He offered me a permanent, incredibly lucrative senior executive position within his newly purged corporate organization. He offered me the money, the power, and the prestige I had supposedly been chasing my entire life. I politely declined the impressive title in the massive corner office. I completely refused to trade my hard-won independence for a different, wealthier kind of corporate silence. Instead, I accepted a highly specific, strictly independent consulting contract. I agreed to personally direct the massive financial restitution program, utilizing my own risk studio to ensure every single stolen dollar was meticulously tracked down, legally extracted, and returned directly to the disaster victims who had been so viciously defrauded. Walking out of the towering glass building and stepping into the bright, blinding Texas afternoon, the air felt incredibly clear and light. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family history had finally fractured and fallen away. The ultimate truth had settled perfectly into place. The real family failure was never the quiet woman standing by the kitchen doors at a luxury wedding banquet. The true failure was the arrogant, empty man who felt absolutely compelled to publicly humiliate his own sister on his wedding day, desperately trying to mask the terrifying reality that he had built his entire glittering fortune by feeding on the absolute worst days of other people's lives. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So, please drop a comment below and share your thoughts with me. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach and be heard by even more people. Thanks to all.